It started with the screech of a shovel against stone and ended in the hushed silence of a miracle. It began with a laugh, sharp and bitter as broken glass, a sound meant to tear down faith itself. But it would end with a single trembling prayer, whispered in a room filled with a scent that had no earthly business being there. This is a story about a man who declared war on heaven, a man who tried to bury mercy under a pile of dirt and rubble. He thought his rage was an impenetrable fortress, his grief a shield that could deflect any light. He was wrong. The battle he chose was not with a plaster statue or a forgotten legend, but with a love so patient, it was willing to wait for him at the absolute bottom of his own personal hell. Stay with this story, because it maps a journey from the deepest darkness into an unexpected dawn. It is a testament to the fact that sometimes the only way to be put back together is to first be completely, devastatingly broken. And sometimes the voice that answers our screams is not a shout, but a profound and healing silence. Sergeant Frank Miller existed in a world the color of dust and rust. The small town of Esperanza clung to the edge of a decommissioned army base like a burr on a worn-out uniform. The paint on the storefronts was peeling, the asphalt on the roads was a mosaic of cracks, and the air itself seemed tired, heavy with the ghosts of soldiers who had long since shipped out. Frank's soul was a perfect match for the landscape. He moved through the town with the heavy, deliberate tread of a man carrying an invisible rucksack full of stones. His heart was a barracks, stripped bare, functional, and devoid of any softness. His face, etched with the lines of desert suns and sleepless nights, was a mask of granite. He had once commanded men, barking orders that could mean life or death. Now his voice was mostly used for clipped one-word answers at the diner or for the occasional venomous remark about the town's lingering superstitions. His target, his personal and public enemy, was a small, weather-beaten statue of the Virgin Mary tucked into a grotto of fieldstones at the edge of the town square. He saw it not as a symbol of hope, but as a monument to lies. To him, she was the queen of false promises, the patron saint of unanswered prayers. "Look at her," he'd grumbled one afternoon to the kid pumping his gas, gesturing with his chin toward the grotto, standing there all calm and peaceful. "What's she ever done for anyone around here? This town's dying on the vine." The kid, a local boy with a crucifix dangling from his rearview mirror, just shrugged uncomfortably. "My abuela says she watches over us." Frank let out a short, ugly laugh. "Yeah, she's doing a real bang-up job of it. Tell your abuela that her watchman is asleep at the post." His contempt was a physical thing, an aura of bitterness that made people step back. He would see the old women of the town, women like Elena Rojas, leaving wildflowers or lighting small votive candles at the statue's feet, and a muscle in his jaw would tighten. He saw their faith not as a comfort, but as a foolish delusion, a crutch for the weak. He had no use for crutches. He had amputated that part of himself long ago. His own home was a reflection of his inner state, immaculate, sterile, and empty. The floors were scrubbed, the bed was made with military precision, and there was not a single photograph on display. There was only a silence so profound it seemed to hum with everything that had been lost. He would sit in the evenings, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at the blank wall where a crucifix used to hang, and he would nurture his anger like a pilot light, a small, constant flame that kept the crushing cold of his grief at bay. He had mistaken this hardness for strength. He believed his cynicism was wisdom. He was a man convinced he had seen the truth of the world, that it was a cold, godless place of random cruelty, and any talk of mercy or divine mothers was a cruel joke played on the desperate. The root of Frank's rage was not in the arid soil of Esperanza, but in a memory, a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and fading hope. The memory would ambush him in the dead of night, after the second or third whiskey failed to do its job. It would rise unbidden, as vivid and painful as the day it was forged. His wife, Maria, had been the light in his life, the absolute center of his orbit. Where he was rigid and disciplined, she was fluid and full of grace, and she was devout. Her faith was not loud or preachy. It was a quiet, constant hum beneath the surface of her days, a source of serene strength that he had secretly admired, even if he didn't understand it. He remembered her hands, always busy, but never more so than when they were wrapped around her rosary beads. Then their daughter, Lily, got sick. She was 6. A vibrant, laughing girl with her mother's eyes, suddenly pale and listless. The diagnosis was a brutal, swift-moving leukemia. The world tilted on its axis. The doctors spoke in hushed, clinical tones about treatments and percentages, but all Frank heard was the roar of his own powerlessness. While he raged at the injustice, Maria prayed. She filled their home with the scent of prayer candles. She draped her rosary over Lily's bedpost. She went to Mass every single day, her lips moving in a ceaseless appeal to the Mother of God. Frank watched it all with a growing knot of resentment in his gut. He saw her devotion as a desperate retreat from reality. "Maria, this isn't helping," he'd said one night, his voice raw. "We need to trust the doctors, the science, not this." She had looked at him, her eyes deep with a pain he couldn't fathom, and said softly, "Frank, this is all I have. She is a mother. She understands." But the mother did not seem to understand. Lily weakened. The treatments ravaged her small body. Frank watched his daughter suffer, and with every pained breath she took, his heart hardened a little more. The breaking point came on a cold, rain-swept Tuesday. The doctor had given them the final, devastating news. There was nothing more they could do. Frank found Maria in the small hospital chapel, kneeling before a statue of the Virgin Mary, identical to the one in Esperanza. She was weeping, her shoulders shaking, her hands clutching the rosary so tightly her knuckles were white. She was begging, pleading, offering her own life in exchange for her child's. Frank stood in the doorway, and something inside him snapped. A cold, black fury washed over him, eclipsing his grief. He strode in, grabbed her arm, and pulled her to her feet. "Stop it!" he hissed, his voice trembling with a rage that shocked them both. "Can't you see? There's nobody there. Nobody is listening." He pointed a shaking finger at the serene, painted face of the statue. "She's just plaster and paint, Maria. She's not a mother. She's not listening. She's letting our baby die." Maria had stared at him, her face a mask of shock and sorrow, and in that moment, he knew he had broken something more than just the chapel's silence. Lily passed away 2 days later. Maria followed her 6 months after that, not from any discernible illness, but as if her heart had simply given up. Frank was left alone with the echo of his own words, a bitter prophecy that had come true. His anger at the statue was not about stone or plaster. It was about that hospital chapel. It was about the memory of his wife's shattered faith and the deafening silence that had answered her most desperate prayer. The heat of the late May morning was thick and oppressive, a blanket smothering the already tired town of Esperanza. It was the day of the annual procession, a tradition that had survived the town's slow decline. It was a small affair, a few dozen of the faithful, mostly older women and their grandchildren, who would walk from the church to the grotto in the square, singing hymns and carrying flowers. To Frank, it was a parade of foolishness, a public display of the very delusion that had stolen his family. The whiskey from the night before was still a sour fire in his belly, and the memory of Maria in the chapel had played on a loop in his mind until dawn. He saw the preparations starting. Elena Rojas and 2 other women were carefully cleaning the grotto, sweeping away leaves and wiping down the small statue of the Virgin with a soft cloth. They laid a clean, embroidered runner at its base. The sight of their tender reverence was like a lit match to the gasoline of his rage. This was it. This public ceremony was an insult to his private pain. An idea, cold and sharp, crystallized in his mind. He wasn't just going to mock it anymore. He was going to end it. He went to his shed and grabbed a shovel. Its wooden handle was smooth in his grip, its metal head heavy and purposeful. He marched toward the square, his boots kicking up puffs of ochre dust. He didn't sneak. He didn't hesitate. He walked with the determined stride of a soldier on a mission. The women at the grotto looked up as he approached, their gentle chatter dying on their lips. A few children playing nearby stopped and stared, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "Senor Miller," Elena said, her voice cautious but not yet fearful. "Can we help you?" Frank didn't answer her. He walked right past them, his eyes locked on the statue. He stopped before it, staring into its painted, placid face. For a moment he saw Maria's eyes pleading with him. He blinked the image away. This was not a mother. This was a lie. "No more," he said, his voice a low growl that carried across the silent square. "No more lies." Then he plunged the shovel into the packed earth at the base of the statue. A collective gasp went through the small crowd. The sound of the metal scraping against dirt and rock was unnaturally loud. "Frank, please, no!" Elena cried, taking a step forward. "Por favor!" He ignored her. He dug with a frenzied, mechanical rhythm. Thud, scrape, toss. The dirt flew, piling up beside the grotto. He was grunting with the effort, sweat plastering his shirt to his back. The children began to cry. A woman ran to get the priest. He worked faster, his breath coming in harsh rasps. He was no longer just digging up a statue. He was trying to excavate the source of all his pain, to rip it out of the ground and expose it to the harsh, unforgiving sun. He hit the concrete base. He threw the shovel aside and grabbed a heavy mallet he'd brought with him. The first blow echoed like a gunshot. A spiderweb of cracks appeared on the plaster pedestal. A woman screamed. With another blow, a chunk of the base broke away. The statue tilted, teetering precariously. He raised the mallet one last time, his face a mask of furious triumph, and brought it down with all his might. The statue of the Virgin Mary toppled forward and shattered on the stone walkway. A gasp, a scream, then silence. A terrible, ringing silence broken only by the sound of a child sobbing and Frank Miller's own ragged breathing as he stood over the wreckage he had made. The silence that fell upon the square that morning did not lift. It followed Frank Miller home and seeped into the walls of his house. It became his new, constant companion. When he walked into the town diner the next day, the usual morning chatter did not just quiet. It ceased. Every head turned to look at him, not with anger, but with a flat, cold judgment that was far worse. The waitress, a girl who usually joked with him about the weak coffee, approached his table, her face a blank mask. She took his order without a word, brought his food, and placed the check on the table, all without once meeting his eyes. It was as if he had become a ghost, a phantom visible only in the periphery. The world had withdrawn from him. The gas station attendant took his money and gave him change in a silent transaction. The mailman, who used to wave, now stared intently at the house across the street as he passed Frank's yard. At the small grocery store, the cashier spoke only to announce his total. He was an island, surrounded by a sea of quiet condemnation. The shunning was not active or aggressive. It was passive and absolute. It was in the averted gazes, the sudden conversations that started just as he walked away, the empty space that always seemed to form around him. He felt the cold draft of his isolation in the warmest part of the day. He was a man erased. He had shouted his rage at the world, and the world had responded by pretending he no longer existed. He told himself he didn't care. He had wanted to be left alone, and now he was. He had wanted to shatter their comforting illusions, and he had. But the victory felt hollow, ashen. The silence in his home, once a refuge, now felt like a tomb. It amplified every small sound, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the frantic beating of his own heart. He tried to fill it with the television, but the cheerful voices on the screen seemed to be mocking him. He tried to fill it with whiskey, but the alcohol only sharpened the edges of his loneliness, making the silence more profound. He had ripped the heart out of the town's simple faith, and in doing so, he had exposed the gaping void in his own. He was no longer just a grieving man. He was the town pariah, the architect of the sacrilege. He moved through the dusty streets of Esperanza, a ghost haunted not by the dead, but by the living. The fortress of Frank's anger, once so impenetrable, began to crumble from the inside out. The isolation was a slow-acting poison. Sleep became a foreign country he could no longer visit. He would lie in his perfectly made bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, while his mind replayed his life's failures on an endless, torturous loop. He saw Lily's pale face. He saw Maria's weeping in the chapel. He saw the statue shattering on the stone path. When he did finally drift off, nightmares ambushed him, chaotic visions of falling from a great height, of being buried alive in suffocating dust. He started to unravel. The military precision that had governed his life dissolved. Dust gathered on the furniture. Dishes piled up in the sink. He stopped shaving, and a ragged, gray-flecked beard colonized his jawline. His hands began to tremble, a fine, persistent tremor that made it difficult to hold a coffee cup. A low-grade fever took hold, leaving him slick with sweat one moment and shivering with a bone-deep chill the next. His body was starting to mirror the sickness in his soul. He was decomposing. The world outside his windows became a blur. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a sun he no longer bothered to watch. He lost his appetite. The whiskey bottle became his most reliable source of calories and his only form of solace. He would sit in his armchair for hours, the bottle cradled in his lap, talking to ghosts. He argued with Maria, defending his actions in the chapel. He tried to explain himself to Lily, his voice a broken croak in the silent room. He was losing his grip, and he knew it. One afternoon, in a moment of desperate lucidity, he tried to call his brother, his only living relative. The phone rang 4 times before his brother's voice, wary and distant, came on the line. "Frank?" Frank opened his mouth to speak. To say what? He wasn't sure. To ask for help, to apologize. But no words came out, only a dry, rasping sound. "Frank, are you there?" "I heard what you did," his brother said, his voice hardening. "Elena Rojas is my wife's cousin. They're all heartbroken. Don't call here again." The click of the phone hanging up was as final as a nail being driven into a coffin lid. That was it. He was completely alone. He stumbled to his chair, the fever raging, the tremors in his hands now violent shakes. He had hit rock bottom, a desolate place where there was no one left to blame, not even a plaster statue. There was only him, the wreckage of his life, and the suffocating, triumphant silence he had so desperately craved. He didn't know if he was asleep or awake when it happened. The fever had blurred the edges of reality, plunging him into a state of delirious exhaustion. He was slumped in his armchair, the empty whiskey bottle on the floor beside him, the house shrouded in the deep gloom of late afternoon. His body ached, his head throbbed, and his spirit was a barren wasteland. Then came the scent. It was the first thing that broke through the miasma of his sickness. It was faint at first, then stronger, a clean, sweet fragrance that was utterly alien to the stale, sour air of the room. It was the smell of roses, fresh, dew-kissed roses, as if a master gardener had just brought in a prize-winning bouquet. It was impossible. There were no flowers in his house, no open windows. Frank's heavy eyelids fluttered open. The room was no longer dark. A soft, gentle light, the color of dawn on a clear morning, was pooling in the corner opposite him. It wasn't a harsh, invasive light. It was calm and inviting, a luminescence that seemed to emanate from within itself, pushing back the shadows without creating new ones. He stared, his fever-addled mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Within the heart of the light, a form began to resolve. It was a woman. She was not a queen on a throne, not an ethereal being of blinding glory. She was simple, dressed in a plain dark blue robe, her head covered. Her face was serene, etched with a sorrow so deep it became a form of peace, and a compassion so vast it was breathtaking. She looked like a mother who had witnessed all the suffering in the world and had chosen love as her only response. It was her. He knew it instantly, with a certainty that bypassed his broken intellect and went straight to the core of his soul. He felt a wave of terror, the primal fear of a sinner standing before the sacred. He expected condemnation. He expected a righteous anger that would dwarf his own pitiful rage. He deserved to be struck down, to be reduced to ash for his blasphemy. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for judgment. But none came. There was no sound, no voice, no accusation. There was only the light, the scent of roses, and an overwhelming, palpable wave of mercy. He dared to open his eyes again. She had not moved. Her expression had not changed. Her gaze was fixed on him, and in it, he saw no anger, no disappointment. He saw only a boundless, unconditional love, a love that saw his rage for what it was, the cry of a broken-hearted child. She didn't need to speak. Her silence was her message. It said, "I see your pain. I am not angry. You are loved." The tremors in his body stilled. The fire of the fever seemed to cool. A single tear, the first he had shed since Lily's death, escaped his eye and traced a hot path through the grime on his cheek. He was not being judged. He was being seen. Overwhelmed, undone, he remained a passive witness as the light began to soften, to recede, and the figure slowly dissolved back into the twilight, leaving behind only the lingering, impossible scent of roses. Frank awoke in his chair as the first true light of morning streamed through the window. The fever was gone. The violent shaking had subsided to a faint trembling in his hands. The house was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not empty, but peaceful. The scent of roses was gone, but the memory of it was seared into his soul. For a long while he did not move. He was a changed man, though he had no words for the transformation that had occurred. The hard, bitter shell around his heart had been shattered, not by a blow, but by a gentle, irresistible pressure. The anger was gone, washed away, and in its place was a vast, aching sense of shame and a fragile, nascent flicker of hope. He did not rationalize the vision. He did not try to explain it away as a symptom of fever or drink. He simply accepted it. He rose from the chair, his movements slow and deliberate. He went into the bathroom and stared at his reflection. The wild beard, the haunted eyes, the face of a man who had been to hell and back. Methodically he washed his face, then took out his old razor and began to shave, scraping away the weeks of neglect. He put on a clean shirt and his old work boots. He knew what he had to do. He walked to the town square, not caring who saw him. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the dusty ground. He went directly to the desecrated grotto. The broken pieces of the plaster statue lay where they had fallen, a sad monument to his fury. He knelt. The act was foreign to him, his knees cracking in protest. But it felt right. It felt necessary. He did not pray with words. His prayer was an action. With painstaking care, he began to gather the fragments. He picked up the largest piece, the torso and shoulders, and gently brushed the dirt from it. He found the head, its serene face miraculously intact, though chipped at the temple. He collected every shard, every sliver of painted plaster, laying them out carefully on the clean cloth Elena had left behind days before. He then went to the town's small hardware store as soon as it opened. He bought the strongest epoxy he could find, a trowel, and a bag of cement mix. He returned to the grotto and began his work. He was not a sculptor. He was not an artist. He was a broken soldier trying to mend what he had broken. His hands, still faintly trembling, were clumsy. The epoxy squeezed out of the seams. The lines did not match up perfectly, but he worked with a reverence and focus he hadn't felt in years. He worked all day under the hot sun, piecing the Virgin back together. It was a slow, humbling, meditative task. He didn't stop for food or water. His penance was his labor. By late afternoon, the statue stood once more on its pedestal, which he had roughly patched with cement. It was scarred. The cracks were visible, a web of dark lines mapping the violence it had endured. It was not perfect. It was more beautiful. It was a statue that knew suffering and had been restored. As a final act, he walked to the edge of town where a few wild desert roses grew, and he plucked a single, pale pink blossom. He returned and placed it at the statue's newly mended feet. The sight of Frank Miller on his knees, painstakingly mending the statue he had destroyed, did not go unnoticed. Windows that had been shut to him now held watchful eyes. The town held its breath, witnessing a quiet act of repentance that was more powerful than any spoken apology. The ripple of healing began slowly. The diner waitress, Maria's younger cousin, watched him work from the window of the restaurant for a long hour. Then, she poured a tall glass of ice water, walked across the square, and set it down on the ground beside him without a word. Frank looked up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in weeks. He saw not condemnation, but a flicker of complex, hesitant forgiveness. He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "Gracias," he whispered. Later that afternoon, the gas station kid, the one with the crucifix in his car, appeared with a small folded tarp. "Looks like it might rain tonight, Sergeant," he said gruffly, not quite looking at Frank. "This'll keep the new cement from washing out." He helped Frank cover the mended statue, the two of them working in a shared, unspoken understanding. The most significant moment came as the sun began to set. casting the square in a warm, golden light. Elena Rojas approached the grotto. She had been the primary witness to his rage, the one who had pleaded with him to stop. Frank tensed, expecting a rebuke he knew he deserved. She stood for a long moment, looking not at him, but at the repaired statue. She saw its scars, the visible lines of glue and cement that held it together. She saw the single, simple rose at its feet. "Sometimes," she said, her voice soft but clear, "the broken things, once they are mended, are stronger." She then turned her gaze to Frank, who was still kneeling on the hard ground, his hands covered in grime and glue. Her eyes were not filled with pity, but with a profound, motherly compassion that reminded him so vividly of the vision. She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Welcome back, Hijo," she said. "Son." The word undid him. He bowed his head, and a quiet sob shook his shoulders. It was a sob not of grief, but of release. The next Sunday, the priest delivered a sermon, not about sin and sacrilege, but about forgiveness and the power of a repentant heart. He didn't mention Frank by name, but everyone in the small church knew who he was talking about. And for the first time in a very long time, Frank Miller was there, sitting alone in the last pew, a quiet shadow no longer shunned, but slowly, cautiously, being welcomed back into the light. The community, wounded by his act, began to heal itself by extending the very mercy he had once mocked. They saw not the man who had destroyed the statue, but the man who had humbled himself to repair it. Frank's life found a new, quiet purpose. He did not become a preacher, shouting his testimony from the rooftops. His transformation was too profound, too personal for loud declarations. His new mission was one of presence, of quiet service. He became the unofficial caretaker of the grotto. Every morning, he would go to the square, sweep the area clean, and ensure there was a fresh flower or a small candle lit. He spoke little, but his actions spoke volumes. The scarred statue became a quiet focal point for the town, a symbol not just of faith, but of redemption. People began to see it differently. Its visible cracks were a reminder that what is broken can be made whole again, perhaps even more beautiful for its history of being mended. Frank's ministry was one of listening. He started volunteering at the county hospice on the edge of town, the same one where Lily had spent her final days. He had avoided it for years, a place saturated with his most painful memories. Now, he walked its halls with a calm he never thought possible. He would sit with the dying, often for hours. He didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances about the afterlife. He simply sat with them in their fear and pain. He held their hands, his own hands no longer trembling. He would listen to their stories, their regrets, their hopes. He offered the gift of his quiet, non-judgmental presence, a comfort he had been so miraculously given in his own darkest hour. He understood their language of suffering because he had been fluent in it. His own deep wound, once the source of his rage, had become the wellspring of his compassion. One evening he was sitting with a woman in her final days. Her daughter, a young woman overwhelmed by grief, was crying softly in the corner. Frank said nothing. He just continued to hold the dying woman's hand. After a while, the daughter came over and sat beside him. "How can you do this?" she asked, her voice thick with tears. "How can you sit here so calmly?" Frank looked at her, and for the first time, he spoke of his own experience, his voice low and steady. "Because I learned that even in the most silent, painful moments," he said, "you are not alone. There is a presence, a love, that is stronger than the pain." He didn't say more. He didn't have to. The quiet certainty in his voice was his testimony, a legacy of grace offered one person at a time in the hushed and holy spaces of suffering. So it was that a story that began with the violent act of unearthing a statue ended with the quiet work of rebuilding a human soul. Frank Miller's journey shows us a profound spiritual truth. Grace is not a reward for the righteous, but a gift that often seeks out the most broken and desolate places. His rage was a fortress built to keep love out, but he discovered that mercy is not an invading army. It is a quiet light that can seep through the tightest cracks. The desecrated statue, once a symbol of his pain, became, in its mended form, a monument to his redemption, stronger at the broken places. His story is a powerful reminder that our deepest wounds do not have to be the end of our story. They can become the very source of our compassion, the gateway to a purpose we never could have imagined. What he tried to destroy in public, he was given back in the privacy of his own broken heart. If this story of transformation touched you, and if you believe that no one is beyond the reach of a second chance, please subscribe to our channel. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that healing can begin in the most unexpected ways. Join us for more stories that explore the moments where the human heart, in all its frailty, meets the divine.